Japan Station is made possible in part by Patreon support. If you would like to make sure that I can keep bringing you more content like this, then head on over to japankyo.com/Patreon and sign up for as little as $1 a month.
Ladies and gentlemen, welcome to Japan Station.
Welcome to Japan Station, a production of japankyo.com. This is the podcast where we help you understand everything you should know about Japan. I'm your host, content creator, founder of japankyo.com, and lifelong Japan enthusiast, Tony R. Vega. I've been to Japan more times than I can count. I've lived there, I've worked there, I've studied there, and I keep going back. I've literally walked across the country from Tokyo to Yamaguchi Prefecture, 900 kilometers. I've had some really unique experiences thanks to my work as a writer and editor, but also just from being in Japan. So when I get to meet somebody that has had even more unique experiences than I had, I get excited. And today you're going to get to hear a conversation with one such person. My guest today is Michael Majors. He's a photographer and journalist. He's worked on many books, including Rice Noodle Fish, and he's also dedicated much of his life to documenting shokunin culture. Shokunin means craftsperson, somebody that dedicates their life to a craft, an artisan. And he has gone around the country meeting incredible people that have spent decades dedicated to their crafts, whether it's tatami makers or potters or chefs. He's met all kinds of people and documented their work. He's a really, really unique person who, like I said, has had some of the most unique experiences that you can have in Japan. And you're going to get to hear about some of those experiences, as well as his work as a photographer and the troubles that Japan is having in preserving the knowledge and expertise of these craftspeople, of these shokunin. As modern society changes ever more rapidly, these people, many of them in their 70s, 80s, and 90s, are dying off. And the knowledge that they have within them isn't being carried on in some cases because they don't have people to carry it on after they're gone. We're going to be talking about that. And of course, Mike is going to share some really, really interesting stories, which I think you're going to enjoy. Of course, if you want to learn more about Michael and his work, you can check out his website, mpmajors.com, or you can find him on Instagram at mpmajors. That's Magers. Links down below. So let's get into it. Here is my conversation with Michael Majors.
But yeah, right now, like I am focused on a couple of projects more in the design world that are focused on kind of promoting and working with shokunin around Japan and starting to communicate some of that work to audiences here in the interior space. So, one of my main beliefs is that the only way that we kind of keep a lot of these ancient traditions alive, whether they're in the food space or whether they're in the craft space, whatever it happens to be, is that we have to figure out ways to make them relevant for people today. And whether that's through utilizing technology, trying to better describe the value of a handmade thing, right? Through showing the chain of creation, the process, et cetera, et cetera. This is what kind of gives them value. So a lot of the stuff I'm doing right now is kind of focused on working with craftsmen to promote what they're doing and find an audience for those products outside of, what might have been their traditional markets.
I would love to learn more about that. I mean, that's a topic that comes up. It's like, how do we've got these 90-year-old masters that are dying without apprentices. The Japanese population is, shrinking and all that. I'd love to maybe dig into that a little bit towards the end of the conversation.
Yes, I have a lot of thoughts. It's a new avenue for me that I've just been starting to kind of work on, bridging that gap between the producer and the consumer at some level, right? But also like trying to find the consumer base that is willing to put appropriate value on craft, right? I think the biggest challenge is that, obviously many of these guys not having deshi is a function of people not wanting to invest the time to learn technique. But the other side of that is that the end product doesn't always have a valuation that actually supports that change. So, trying to elevate and find new avenues, find new ways to repurpose traditional craft in either an artistic sense or in a more functional sense, right? There's an amazing tatami weaver in Kyoto who's trying to, make furniture out of tatami, right? So that's an interesting way that, it can be repurposed into a higher value object that is, useful and fungible outside of Japan, right? Because most people outside of Japan don't buy tatami, but they do buy like beautiful, wickerware. And tatami is basically it's a woven wicker type product. Yeah. So
I love that.
Things like that are, it's kind of the evolution of what I've been doing, documenting craft for, 13, 14 years now. And, wanting to kind of preserve some of that visually, right? To your point that many of these guys don't have anyone to succeed them. I mean, I was in Kyoto. One of my all-time favorite ceramic artists is a guy called Kimura Moriyasu, and he does a temoku glazing, which is just like, it's the coolest thing to me because he really, like, the number of fired vessels that actually kind of come out looking the way he wants them to look is incredibly small. As a percentage of how many vessels he fires, right? So like your hit rate's pretty low. And, he's 89. He doesn't have an apprentice. He's like, I'm just going to work every day until I die. Like that's just what I'm going to do. And his work is incredible. It's like psychedelic almost in its depth and in its, variety of how the glaze comes together. So when I see that, it kind of breaks my heart at some level. I know, right? I know. Like, not to take anything away from, him and all the work that he's done, but there's also the sense of like when he goes, it goes with him, right?
Yeah,
and
there's so much I want to say right now, but I don't want to have you repeat yourself. So
no.
How about we start from the beginning and then we'll get into this and then we can. Like, I want to value your time too, and this is like I want to dig into this, but
man.
Do it twice,
you're recording all this.
So let's start from the beginning. So just for anybody that's not familiar with you, so could you tell us a little bit about yourself and what you do?
Sure. So my name's Mike Majors. I am a documentary photographer. I actually started out my career as a commodity trader. I worked in New York and San Francisco and was initially importing and exporting coffee, sugar, and cocoa. So that took me to a lot of interesting places around the world. And sometimes, might be living in the Mexican jungle for a couple of months during the harvest. And photography was always something that was part of my life since I was pretty young. But it wasn't until that experience that I started thinking more about like the documentary side of it. And I left trading with a very naive notion that I could transition into being a full-time photographer. And I emailed every editor at every publication I could think of. And I got absolutely zero responses back, which was a bit of a shock because I was coming from the business world. And in the business world, like people at least tell you, any not for us or go to hell, stop emailing us, whatever it is. The only person that responded to me was a guy called Nathan Thornburg, who had just launched a website called Roads and Kingdoms. And Nate agreed to meet for coffee and said, I like your work. I think we can do something with you. We'll give you a call. We've just launched the site. We will let you know if something comes up. And a few months later, he called me out of the blue and he said, we are going to Chile to do a retrospective on the 40th anniversary of the military coup with a guy called Dave Burnett. Dave Burnett's a legendary photojournalist, one of the true greats, still working today. But photographed every president since Kennedy, has done every Olympics, I think, since the mid 80s. I mean, won every award in the book. Anyway, he was in Chile in 73, photographing during the coup. had shot some really indelible images that won him the Kappa Award, which is the highest award for conflict reporting. And the goal was to go back and find some of these people that he shot during that period, which we did. We actually reunited two women. Last time they'd seen each other was at Pablo Neruda's funeral. And it was a really powerful and intense trip, not surprisingly. We all, bonded quite a bit in those situations that can happen. But after that trip, I said, hey, look, I'm going to Japan. I'd been once before. I kind of fell in love with it as a tourist, and I wanted to go back and just spend some more time. And Nathan said, my business partner, Matt Goulding, is going to be there on his honeymoon. Maybe you guys can link up and do a story or two. I said, great, sounds awesome, right? So Matt and I ended up meeting at a junket dinner to celebrate the 10th anniversary of the filming of Lost in Translation at the Park Hyatt in Shinjuku.
Oh, wow.
And no one from Lost in Translation was there, but the Park Hyatt was marking the anniversary. And actually it was fairly interesting because I learned a lot about the filming of that movie that I didn't know from management at the Park Hyatt. The most interesting tidbit, and I'll share this quickly, was that they were only allowed to film, I believe, from 10 p.m. to 7 or 8 a.m. because of not wanting to disturb the other guests. Mm-hmm. And when you watch the movie, that sense of kind of jet lagged suspension of time was actually the actor's experience, because most of the filming was happening in these kind of weird off hours. Mm-hmm. So I took a lot away from that. In any case, Matt pulled me aside at the end of the night and he said, look, I had a few glasses of sake the other night and I emailed Anthony Bourdain out of the blue a pitch about doing a book looking at the intersection of food and culture in Japan. How would you like to roll around for the next 3 or 4 weeks and photograph what will basically become our pitch? And I just said, are you kidding me? I was on a trading desk a year ago, right? I mean, this is sort of a dream opportunity. And that book became Rice Noodle Fish, which was kind of the first in a series of 3 that Matt wrote and that Tony published. And it kicked off for me a lifelong interest in this idea of shokunin, this concept of kind of the pursuit of refinement over perfection. And because the book was so driven by food, the intersection of craft around food, things like knives and ceramics and ikebana and things that tie into tea ceremony, they all became kind of fair game to document. So it's a bit of a long-winded intro, but it gives you a bit of context as to, who I am, how I came to Japan. Obviously, I've worked in a lot of other countries and I've worked for a lot of other publications over the years, but Japan is a place that I keep returning to. I've been more than 20 times in the past, 13 years, typically for 3 or 4 weeks at a time, and almost always to kind of open up another little door or a seam or a crack of light in a place that you could visit for the rest of your life and barely scratch the surface.
Yeah, no, I love that story. And just kind of came out of nowhere, yeah, I'd love to do that. It's when do I start? Right? That's the dream situation. What was it like that first time? Now you're seasoned. I'm sure you pretty familiar with the Japanese language. I don't know to what extent, but you probably are very comfortable in Japan for the most part. But that first time, were you with other people going around? Were you by yourself? Were you in uncomfortable situations? What was it like that first time?
It's a great question, mostly because, and this, the act of traveling to Japan has gotten so much easier.
Yes.
Over the past few years. That first trip was with a good friend of mine. And, there was no Google Translate. There was no iPhone. Maps were paper at best. I had a BlackBerry, right? That was kind of the extent of my communication devices. And were it not for a incredibly fortunate, serendipitous meeting with a guy called Shinji Nohara, who is a legend in the Tokyo food world. He's known as the Tokyo Fixer. Were it not for meeting Shinji very randomly, I don't think I would have gone back to Japan with the same level of interest, passion, etc. I bumbled around for the first few days, as I'm sure you have, with a paper map, feeling utterly confused, doing largely the headline tourist things in Tokyo. And it wasn't until Shinji took me to a coffee shop it doesn't exist anymore. It was run by a guy called Katsuji Daibo, who had a coffee shop in Omotesando. And I had worked in the coffee business. I used to cup coffee for a couple of hours every day. And I went, and Daibo-san would roast the coffee, not quite to order, but 5 or 6 times a day. Each cup took between 15 and 20 minutes to make. And it was like tasting coffee for the first time. Truly, I felt like I was having this out-of-body experience. And I was like, I get it. This is the thing. And this is the thing that permeates across almost every strata of Japanese culture, down to the guy stocking the shelf at the 7-Eleven or the man sweeping the stairs on the subway. And I just kind of wanted to learn more, So that first trip went from being a very standard surface level tourist experience to being one that quickly pulled me into the deep water. And I just knew that without being otaku, without being someone who perhaps sees Japan through rose-colored glasses, right? I understand the challenges. I especially understand the challenges for outsiders or people who are doing things that are different. But the level of quality, the attention to detail, and the intention that goes into things was like opening up a portal into a different world for me.
Yeah. I mean, to get that kind of, access and to be able to talk to those kind of people, just from the first or second time that you've been in Japan, I can totally understand, okay, I need to go deeper and deeper and deeper, right? That is so interesting. And you've had some amazing experiences, the kinds of things that most people never get to experience. And I want to ask you about some of those experiences that you've had while documenting all these shokunin and these people around Japan. Could you, for example, I heard you talk about one time in a podcast in Japan Eats, how you ended up getting a tattoo. You never thought you would, but because of your work and where you were in that moment, you thought that's what you should do. How did that come about? How did you meet this tattoo artist in Japan? And then how did that experience go? Of you documenting all of that?
So I fell into documenting shokunin initially as we were working on the first cut of Rice Noodle Fish. And basically I just said, hey, if we're going to do a great kaiseki chef or something in sushi, then maybe we should figure out the guys that make the knives, right? That was literally the first kind of idea. And through that got connected with some knife makers in Sakai outside of Osaka. And that's what really pulled me deeply into this pursuit of photographing shokunin. After I'd been working on that for a few years, I actually ran across a book by the photographer Martha Cooper from 1970 called Tokyo Tattoo. And it was a short book. I think I found it in Sweden, believe it or not. I was looking at the copy the other day. But it is a very short book of some documentary photography around traditional tattooing in Tokyo in the early 70s, right? So tebori, working, by hand, not with a gun. And I thought, all right, well, I know how taboo all of this is, but if you can achieve this level of artistry in arguably the hardest canvas of all, right? The human body, this thing that's changing all the time, that's flinching, that's moving, that's attached to a living, breathing thing. And you're doing it with technology that is, hundreds of years old. You're not using a tattoo gun. That is shokunin. It may not fit the ningen kokuo, living national treasure definition, because the output is, for better or for worse, linked to societal outcasts or criminal underworld, et cetera, et cetera. So I started trying to track down who was still working with tebori, in Japan. And it's a really small number of people. I mean, actually, I reached out to a couple of the big headline tattoo artists, right? And they were like, yeah, once we got a gun, man, we're not doing that anymore. Like, it's way too time consuming. Found a guy in Osaka, Horihiro, who let me come into the studio for a bit. But the person I was really interested in was Horiren, who's really one of the only women in this world. And it took about a year before she was willing to let me come into the studio, right? And some of this is a function of just trust. Some of it's a function of her clientele. And after I had spent, a fair amount of time just being a fly on the wall, I was in the studio one day and there was a 2-hour break, I think, between clients. And, my Japanese is okay. It's not, we're not going to talk about, anything too detailed, but her English is kind of there. And my Japanese is kind of there. And she was like, Mike-san, would you like a tattoo? And I said, the only thing I want, if we do it, is it's got to be only tebori and I need to be able to hide it. Right. So like those are the only two criteria. So she did a really small set of cherry blossoms on one shoulder, and it took 2 hours, right, to do this very small detail. And I was like, wow, that's kind of cool, but it's a little small. I might need a little bit more than that. So over the next years, we've been together. The relationship that you kind of form between the tattooer, the artist, and the person being tattooed it's quite deep, So she's done a number of pieces on me, and, one took 45, 50 hours to complete, another probably 35, 40 hours. You just spend a lot of time together. And a lot of it's in silence because, like I said, we're not really chit-chatting in Japanese. Sometimes you're in your own head because of the pain. But it was a totally spontaneous thing that then became something that I just wanted to explore further. And I think photographically, there's always been a part of me that feels like, I need to be in my subject's space, right? So like, I don't work with long lenses. I don't work from far away. All of my work is shot on, wide angle fixed lenses. I'm very close to my subjects. So if I'm photographing a surfer, like I'm in the water with a surfer. So it seemed a little bit disingenuous not to like figure out what a tattoo might feel like. And it's really like an honor, it is a very small club at some level to have been a piece of this canvas.
That is interesting. And I'm sure, especially when we brought up the word shokunin a few times, these people that dedicate their lives to these crafts, and many of them, decades, right? They can be in their 80s and 90s. And then you come along and you express this genuine interest in this thing that a lot of times people in mainstream Japanese society, they may not even know like all the intricacies are they're like, oh yeah, you make dishes or something, like, oh, okay, cool. Like that's the level of awareness in a lot of Japanese people, because these are kind of niche traditional things. But then you come along and you seem like genuinely interested, want to document it. You want to, I can assume that you've gotten many people that have shown a sense of appreciation for your seemingly genuine curiosity. Like, have you gotten people express that to you?
Absolutely. I think that, as you say, it's funny when I will speak with Japanese friends, they might say, oh, wow, I didn't know this existed.
Yeah. Right.
Or I've never seen it like that before. And it goes back to this idea that, oftentimes we are focused on the output, right, rather than the process. I will say that like NHK has done a lot of work, especially with the kind of Living National Treasures set, to try and focus and show some of that work, history, background, that kind of thing, to the extent that it's well produced. It's maybe a bit variable at times, right? NHK throws a ton of content out there, but they are very aware and they do try and do that. But I don't know how much of that, as you rightly point out, reaches your average salary man. per se. So I think the tattoo thing was probably the one that shocked my Japanese friends the most at some level, right? Just the access, seeing behind the scenes, seeing the process of it. Because you might see a little bit of it if you're like at the Sanja Matsuri, you might see a guy with his shirt off or something like that, right? But for the most part, your average citizen is not, interacting with someone with a lot of traditional tattoos. It's not at an onsen or a sento or anything like that. Certainly not at the beach or a gym. There's a lot of discrimination. So, it's one thing to put out a series of images of a, kimono weaver or a ceramic artist or a knife maker where the end product is familiar and the process is at least somewhat familiar. Very few people had seen the tebori aspect of things. And I think what's interesting is when I look at Martha Cooper's photos from 1970, virtually nothing's changed.
Right.
I mean, the sanitation is better, but that's about it.
Yeah. So you mentioned a couple other experiences that you've had, Sanya Matsuri. I've read about, your experience with Amma divers. Could you tell us about like some of these other unique, whatever, is particularly memorable or comes to mind at the moment? Like, again, these are a lot of times experiences that most people will never have the opportunity to have. So I'm just curious about, getting access and the process. Like, hey, can I go do this with you? Can I check this out? Like, what really sticks out in your mind of that you've been able to do in the past, all these times that you've been to Japan?
Well, I'll tell you, recently, I actually had an experience that kind of blew my mind, right?
Okay, I'm curious.
So a friend in Osaka invited me to participate in the Danjiri Matsuri, which I'm not sure if you're
okay. Yeah, please tell. I mean, this is like an infamous, kind of dangerous. Like,
it's crazy. People die in this every year, and we were, integrated into one of the teams, so I had, all access basically, and the Danjiri Matsuri is it takes place outside of Osaka, and it's essentially groups of Matsuri teams are pulling the shrines on these kind of wooden wheels that don't have a lot of balance or play. And over the course of the day, on the Sunday of this Matsuri, the act of pulling these things gets faster and goes through narrower streets. And basically what you're doing is you're trying to see how fast you can get it going to then turn a very, very tight 90-degree corner. It's very, very common for these things to go careening into the side of a shop, to partially tip over. People have been pretty seriously injured when they fall over completely, which does happen. Although the only experience I had that was close to that was, getting flattened, absolutely pancaked by a team that had one tip over and half the team just, flies into the crowd at that corner. I have a video of it. You just see this thing careening towards you, and then suddenly the camera's like flying out of my hand. But it is really rowdy. It's hot. It's taking place in September, so it's pretty hot. And as far as I know, there's really nothing like it in Japan. It had always been explained to me as this is the craziest one. So when I got to go and see it, I was in Hokkaido, and the only way that I could make this work, I was in Hakodate for a shoot that Saturday. And the literal only way I could get there in time, because I couldn't fly to Kansai in time, was to take the train, the Shinkansen, all the way down from Hakodate to Osaka Station, that 5 a.m. train that Sunday morning. So I was on a train for 8 hours, 9 hours, hop off, and then just go straight into the craziness. And that was really, really cool. Again, something that a lot of my Japanese friends from other parts of the country were like, we've heard about this, but we've never actually seen it. So something like that, I wasn't there on any assignment. It's just, this is a really cool thing to see. Diving with the Amma, I think, would probably rank in one of the coolest experiences of my life. Such a special thing to be with them in the water. Again, this idea of being a participatory photographer, being someone who works alongside my subjects, experiences what they're experiencing, helps to inform the images, and I think gives a perspective that's a bit more intimate.
Mm-hmm.
So that came about actually through the same friend who invited me to the Danjiri Matsuri. Said, hey, look, I am connected with some of these women. How would you like to go down and meet them? And so virtually all of these experiences just come from saying yes, and to, I think, treating people with a lot of respect, and being willing to put the camera away when it's called for, right? Knowing that this is a long game, and knowing that the access that I have is contingent on not just my reputation, but other people's reputations as well.
Mm-hmm.
So feeling the weight of that and wanting to honor it, wanting to be respectful of the situation. And my experience to this point has been that the subjects also understand that and feel that, and know that I'm there with the goal of showing an aspect of them or their lives that they don't have to pose for, right? It is just the nature of who they are and what they do. And whether that's being a fly on the wall, in an incredible studio, or being in the water with someone while they dive, or, trying to avoid getting run over by a crazy Mikoshi, on wheels, shrine on wheels, then that is, there's just no better feeling.
Absolutely. Could you tell us just a little bit more about the divers? Like how many, like who were these individuals? Like, is this what they like live off of? Is this like, how has that, because obviously this is a dying thing. Like, it's not like how it used to be, but like, what did you observe while you were there?
You're totally right.
Mm-hmm.
It's interesting though, actually, because there's been a resurgence in high-end restaurants seeking out this type of foraging for seafood, right? So Noma has a diver. The Monterey Bay Seafood Company, I believe, is the name. They have abalone and urchin divers in California. There is actually something to this because of the sustainability, because of the taste, quite frankly. It just tastes better. So the AMA as a job, i.e., hand harvesting rare seafood in dangerous conditions, was something that was popularized, a long time ago. And I don't know how many hundreds of years. I have this written down someplace, but it's been 7 or 8 years since I wrote the article. But, initially we know them as pearl divers, from even going back to ukiyo-e, going back to woodblock carvings from the Edo period. That pearl diving obviously doesn't exist anymore because everything is farmed and such. But the transition to gathering high value seafood, right, which could be abalone, it could be sea urchin, it could be octopus, and it also could be seaweed, is something that did persist. And there are still pockets of these women, because it is only women that do it, much like the Haenyeo on Jeju Island in Korea, still exist in Toba and Ise-shima, and there's also some on the western coast, that sort of northwestern coast as well. I haven't visited that. I was in Toba and Mie, but it's a very small group, and they don't dive as often as they used to. Right? It's not a full-time job. Actually, the sort of main woman that I was spending time with ran a small minshuku, a small little inn there. I think that was kind of her main source of income. But they love it, and it's a way to have some autonomy over their finances, right? Something that sort of came up. And also, as they say, like, if they're having a bad day, if they feel sick, they dive, right? Mm-hmm. It is something that, much like any other craft, requires total focus, and it's extremely dangerous. I mean, people die doing this. The conditions are hard. The water is cold. They're holding their breath for long periods of time, and then they're in their 60s, some even older. So there was apparently a slight resurgence in interest in the lifestyle because there was a popular soap opera on Japanese TV for a while about a young woman who goes and sort of takes up diving. And so they would have people come from Tokyo even to, sort of try and live the lifestyle. But I think it's quite difficult to do it full time. And there's not like a massive market for this stuff. So it, like many things in Japan, may be kept alive by some of the more touristic aspects. There is sort of a AMA museum and things that are there to demonstrate technique and demonstrate what they do. But for people who are doing it as a source of income, as a lifestyle, as a choice, I think that's, again, probably fading pretty quickly.
Yeah. I want to get deeper into that aspect of things and the future of shokunin culture and this kind of stuff. But before we get into that, I want to ask you, as someone who has gotten to talk to these amazing people that have been producing amazing things, and you've worked Rice Noodle Fish and Anthony Bourdain, I can't help but wonder, what are some of the best meals you've had? Are there any particularly like memorable meals that you've had in Japan that you can tell us about?
Oh man, I mean, like every time I go, it's incredible. I mean, truly, one of the most amazing experiences food-wise was treading water, with the ama and having them literally like cracking sea urchin
Oh my God.
in the middle of the ocean and like handing it to you.
Yeah.
That was insane. Who gets to do that? I have my places. I have the places that I go back to. I think that what Imai-san is doing at Monk is really special, and I know they've gotten a incredible amount of press and chef's table and everything else. But it is a really special meal. Certainly, tempura matsu in Kyoto, just next to Arashiyama, is a place that we featured in Rice Noodle Fish, and spent a lot of time with Toshio and his family, and it is absolutely one of my favorite meals and experiences in the world. Zayu Hasegawa at Den in Tokyo, such a special person, such an incredible cook, so playful, so creative. I love those guys. They're family. Ioana Morelli and Hisashi Watanabe, who run Bargu up in Niseko. There's no hospitality like it in the world. It's truly one of the best bars on the planet. All of these places are that incredibly special mix of highest level of execution paired with ingredients par excellence and omotenashi, like a level of hospitality, a level of presence and presence that is just unmatched. But I could go on and on. Like there have been so many experiences that are, just my classic egg sando, right? I mean, it doesn't have to be, super high end. The banana pancakes at Local in Tokyo, right? I mean, these things are all, it comes down to a culture of, again, attention to detail and intention. What I always tell people who are traveling to Japan is you really have to try hard to have a bad hospitality experience, right? It's not like, I can go to Rome and have a mediocre meal. You shouldn't, right? There's plenty of incredible options, but if you don't know and you get sucked into a, touristy place, pasta so-so, et cetera, et cetera. In Tokyo, it's almost never going to happen. I mean, you can eat incredibly well at a Lawson, like a convenience store.
Yeah. It really, like, when I'm in Japan, I rarely worry like, oh my God, is this place going to be bad? Is it going to rip me off? The prices tend to be very, very good, if not, reasonable. And even like the cheap places, like just the middle of nowhere, this like rinky dink little like 6-seat, dirty, kind of looking-ish kind of place. I go in there and awesome food. Like I just, these people, I don't know, like they just care about putting out a good product for the price, even if they're not like, this fancy restaurant. It's just, I don't come across that, for example, here in Hawaii. I've been to many places here in Hawaii where I go like, oh man, that was expensive and bad. It's so disappointing.
It's the thing that I will always remind people of when they go. Tokyo has 100,000 restaurants, give or take. Yeah. New York City, I think it's 10,000. Mm-hmm. I mean, it's very, very difficult to get a bad meal. You might not always get what you want, and sure, you might have a hard time communicating what you want. That's all totally reasonable. Mm-hmm. But as you say, I can't think of any experience I've had that wasn't at least pretty darn tasty. And then obviously, as you move up that scale and the level of ingredients, the level of execution, all of that comes together with hospitality and setting, that's when things become transcendent.
Mm-hmm, mm-hmm, mm-hmm. All right. So we've been kind of touching on it here and there, and this idea of shokunin culture and these guys and women and people that dedicate their lives to these things. But from even just going off of what you've been telling me here, I'm seeing a divide. Like there's for example, chefs and people that deal with like food and that kind of stuff that can be very easily commercialized. And then there's this other aspect of these dying traditions that aren't so easily commercialized, and yet of course they have value, cultural, historical value. Can you talk a little bit about your thoughts on that and your work as it relates to that? And I know you're kind of thinking about that in the future and your upcoming work as well. So I would love to kind of get your ideas on that aspect of all of this.
You're absolutely right, and it's something that permeates a lot of traditions around the world. It permeates food culture around the world. I think that Matt Goulding and Renee Redzepi's series on Apple TV, Omnivore, really did a beautiful job of diving into this specifically around food traditions around the world. And in the craft space, it's been so easy to turn people culturally from consumption of handmade products to single-use or virtually single-use objects because of the cost, because of the ease, because it's simply a world dominated by Amazon or Temu or Shine or any of these companies that allow access to a facsimile of what might be luxury, right? And I have always conceptualized and connected handmade goods to the concept of luxury, not from a cost perspective, but because to me, owning something that possesses the spirit of the artisan baked into it is simply a higher level of connection than my plates from IKEA, which is not a judgment on the ability of a company to sort of replicate high design at a low cost. But if you think about the world through the lens of fewer, better things, to me, there's no higher version of better than something that's handmade, and handmade at a high level. So trying to figure out how traditional craft moves forward in a market in which objects in some sense have been devalued is a massive challenge. And I think that there's a couple of different avenues through which artisans are able to carry this forward. It doesn't address the other point that you mentioned about not having apprentices or not having people who are willing to take these on. But the two areas that I've kind of seen create avenues for success, one of them is focusing on the artistic side of the object. So rather than making things that are purely functional, many of the younger generation of shokunin have been making things that are both functional and artistic, or purely artistic, right? And obviously, the difference between an artist and a craftsman is a blurry line. One definition that I've heard, which I think is a reasonable starting point, is that a craftsman is working on something for a client, whereas an artist is oftentimes creating within their own vision for themselves and then selling that. So many of the shokunin that I've gotten close to over the years who are younger are kind of blurring that line. A guy that I can, sort of think very specifically about is Shuji Nakagawa, son of a living national treasure. He's a woodworker in Shiga, makes these incredible wooden, buckets, basically, except they have been shown in the Venice Biennale. He's done partnerships with, big luxury brands, right? It is carrying craft forward in a way that intersects both with the luxury world and the art world. So that's an avenue, right? I think that the other avenue that we've seen, and something specifically in the food world, is trying to modernize the technological piece of it a little bit, so that there's a way to carry these things forward, right? These traditions forward, whether it's food or whether it's craft, that isn't necessarily relying just on technology from 150 years ago, which if you go into many of these workshops, they haven't changed. So that, I think, helps bring in younger generation potentially. I'm not saying that, you're AutoCADing and CNCing, wood buckets going forward, because it's then no longer handmade. But there is probably some marriage there to improve the production process and supply chain, that sort of thing. So I don't know for sure whether or not these are, guaranteed to save a portion of this, right? I think focusing on the artistic side in that market will always command a higher price. But then it also at some level changes the interaction, right? So like Soetsu Unagi, who wrote The Unknown Craftsman with Bernard Leach and kind of was the founder of the Minge movement, what they always said, and you talk to any shokunin, they're like, use these things, use them. They're not meant to just be an object on a wall or an object on a shelf, right? My tea bowls, my chawan, they're made to be used. My knives, they're made to be used, right? My kimono, they're made to be worn. So if we focus too much on something as an object of art, then it might devalue some of the functional capability. And I think there's a fine line to kind of draw there. I make a matcha every morning, and I can tell you that it's an incredibly pleasurable thing to go and like pull out a beautiful tea bowl and just have that tactile interaction. There's something special about it. So it can still be a beautiful work of art, but it's not going to fall apart if I put hot water and matcha in it and give it a nice whisk. I don't know if that gets to even touching on this question or not, because it's a massive, demographic aspect of this. There's a cultural aspect. There's a time investment aspect. I mean, when I initially started down this road, I kind of had a set of questions that I would ask all of the folks I was photographing. And one of those questions was always, how long did it take before you felt like you had kind of a grasp of what you were doing, right? And, pretty much to a person, that time frame was your classic 10,000 hours, right? It took me 8 to 12 years to learn technique, and now I'm 80, and so I have a fairly good grasp of what I'm doing. And I don't think we see that as normal in kind of the society that we live in now, where we want it now. We quit on things very quickly if we don't get good at them. My friend Karen Rinaldi, who published Kitchen Confidential, wrote a book a few years ago called Suck at Something. And it's literally about the value of all of the failure that you go through getting to those 10,000 hours. So I think that it's very hard, given we live in a society that almost demands instant gratification, you have to be a little bit different to be willing to put in that time. It doesn't mean that there aren't people who are willing to do it. It just means that it's a different career path than it might have been 75 years ago.
Yeah.
And it's not one that has a clear path to financial reward that comes easy. Certainly there are people who are naturally talented, of course, but I think most people, learning technique takes time. You have to learn feel. You have to, the best way I heard it put, and it's still to this day, like it's seared into my brain. I was interviewing a ceramic artist in Arita, Inui Manje. He's the Ningen Koko, the living national treasure for Arita Yaki. I saw him a couple of years ago too. He's like in his 90s now. He's great. Anyway, he said, look, I'll break it down for you very simply. It took me 10 years to learn the technique, but it's taken me my entire lifetime to figure out how to transmit my soul into my hands. And it's just like, it's perfect. It's the perfect explanation.
Yeah. And it's, like I said, earlier, there's the younger population in Japan that, just realistic reasons, like, are they going to do that, when they need to support their family and this and that? Like, it's a risky road to go down. But at the same time, you also mentioned how there's these innovations and these different ways to do things. Like you mentioned the example of this tatami maker, using the tatami in furniture, right? So like that keeps the tradition alive, but it repackages it in a way that would be appealing, not even just to Japan, but like people around the world. They think like, oh, that's a cool thing. And it has this like long tradition, this craftsman did it. And that is like one interesting way to make that a viable thing for, somebody that is doing this kind of work. But it's difficult, right? It's really difficult.
It's a question that we may not fully understand until the demographics force us to, and that's going to hit in the next 5 to 10 years.
Yeah.
And really lose this oldest generation.
Yeah.
And I don't know what it's going to look like, but I suspect that under any circumstance, there will be less people making these things.
Yeah. So I do want to start to wrap up, but I have one more question about this. In your work, talking to all these people, have you come across people from outside of Japan that have, started doing these things, being apprentices? Because I hear stories every once in a while of, somebody taking an interest and going to Japan and doing this, like doing katana and these kinds of things, like every once in a while. I wonder if you've come across any of these individuals in all your many, interviews and meetings with people.
I've heard stories as well. I think that the area in which the depth has been there consistently is really in food. So I know a number of really talented cooks and chefs who have spent time, under shokunin in the food world. In the craft world, less so. I mean, there are some notable examples, J.B. Blanc being one, studied with Rosanjin after the Korean War. And I've definitely heard of other folks certainly coming in, doing short stints, that kind of thing, but not never, but certainly I think it's a bit further afield to have someone come and spend, 5 to 7 years as a deshi, as an apprentice. It's quite difficult, right? I mean, it's not like going to a school. Technique is taught visually. If you don't speak Japanese, I think it would be incredibly difficult, especially around some of the technical or chemical aspects, whether it's, forging or glazing, that kind of thing. So while I know it exists, and I'm positive it exists, I think that it is oftentimes like more cross-cultural communication rather than someone coming and saying, okay, I'm going to, do this for the rest of my life in Shiga, right? We've seen it in sake. There's definitely been some Western tojis that have come in and learned. So again, it's not totally out of the question. It's just it's a small percentage. It's a small percentage, I think, of in any culture, you know, because it's hard. It's really hard. I mean, it is. Think about learning a martial art or learning something that is a combination of physicality and intellect. You're not going to pick it up in a month or two.
Yeah. It's tough. And, then you bring in the whole like visa situation and stuff. It's like,
right. Forgetting about all that.
Yeah. Even if there is somebody that wants to go trade in pottery, like, okay, how do I get the visa? Right. Like, how does that work? So
well, am I going to get
complicated
paid
topic
to do this? How, is there financial support? I mean, the old days, you didn't really get paid to be a dashi. And remember that the other side of this too is like a lot of craft is familial, right? It's being passed down through lineages. So it's a tougher thing to compete with the modern world and modern opportunity, right? And a lot of pressure on the children of these folks too. So I do know actually quite a few shokunin who are, the father is still alive, but they have kind of taken over, right, at some level, or they are pushing these things. The Goan crew in Kyoto, Nakagawa, the Kakaido guys, the Asahiyaki, Matsubayashi-san, Hoso-san. They're really trying to push this into the global market, add that kind of luxury and art angle to it. And I think that's how it survives. I just think you have to push it, as you pointed out, into repurposing, into the global luxury space, the global art space. And that's what opens up new markets. And maybe, the side effect of all that is it exposes people outside of Japan to these things, and it gets them thinking about it if they're working in their own countries. So,
absolutely.
It's not a guarded thing. It's not, we're not making the secret sauce here, right? There's a lot of cross-pollination that happens in these crafts. Even if you think about the proliferation of content now on YouTube and Instagram of people working, it didn't exist 10 years ago. You might be in a studio in Barcelona and be inspired by somebody, working in Kanazawa. You don't necessarily get to sit right next to them, but, you might sort of figure out, like, well, how do they do that? So I think that's really cool. I think those are the kinds of things that help push this stuff forward. And that's why I say, like, the embracing of technology, the embracing of these new markets, being open to learning from different sources is hopefully the thing that allows these beautiful traditions to kind of coexist, in a world that is just really focused on the next millisecond most of the time.
Yeah. It's, I'm reminded of, for example, this was a few years ago, somebody that they made the Hanko stamps, right? And they, I can't remember exactly what they did, but they did something really creative, like some really cute kind of stamp, and that went like viral online.
Yeah, I remember that.
Oh, okay,
you only like one guy left that was doing it or something like that.
Yeah.
It was literally this thing that was. I mean, it was, you couldn't define a dying art, more than it. And somebody kind of figured out a way to make it, I don't know, viral, and every one of those things extends the life and helps cross-pollinate. What we need are consumers to value the product.
Yeah.
And I think the way that the product gets valued is when you understand the amount of effort it takes to make it.
Exactly.
So largely, like, what I am interested in and what I've tried to do over the course of this career is to show people the person behind the object and the act of creation, because I think that helps define the value in a way that's very different than just seeing the object in a vacuum.
100%. Yeah. I mean, nowadays our assumption is that was produced in a factory, but when you see the story behind it and all that went into creating the thing, you can assign value to it, right? It's not just like $1 from the store. It's actually a lifetime, decades of work that went into this dish, for example.
Yes, every single time.
Mm-hmm.
And there's a reason why the movie Jiro Dreams of Sushi hit people really hard and gained such a massive global audience. It's because we had never seen the amount of effort, the amount of thought, the amount of hard work and struggle that went into a piece of raw fish on vinegared rice. It's the most simple thing in the world, and it's very, very compelling to see what happens in the lead up to that act of creation. It's like being, in the studio with a great musician. It's the same kind of thing.
Absolutely. Yeah. So, as we wrap up, if people are interested in learning more about your work or getting something that you've produced, like what's the best thing to check out? What's your most recent thing? Or like, where do you want to direct people? What do you want to tell people about?
Yeah. I mean, that's always nice to have an inbound inquiry, right? So I do have a website. It's mpmagers.com. So just my two first initials and my last name, Majors, which is also my Instagram handle. I'm typically only active on social media if I'm working on something specifically. Otherwise, I'm usually a little bit incognito. But I'm easily reachable through either of those venues, and always happy to expand on these ideas, to do more to help document and support and promote, what I think are really important ways of life, interactions with the physical world, and reflections of beauty, reflections of the human spirit. There's like I said, having the soul of the artist in a piece of work to me is kind of the highest level of value you can have on a physical object.
Absolutely. And is there any, your most recent book or anything, is that still on sale, or how's that?
You can still buy it through my website. There's a few copies left.
Okay.
And it's, that's, largely focused on personal work, but it's an interesting, overview of my life for the past 10 years. So
Independent
a lot of
Mysteries,
time on the road. Right? Independent Mysteries, a largely personal project, an exploration of kind of intimate distance and connection and disconnection from a life which has taken me around the world and spent a lot of time on my own in hotels and on the street and that kind of thing. So,
and there's some Japan stuff in there, right?
There's a lot of Japan stuff in there. It does span, I think, 25 countries or something like that. But there's a lot of stuff from Japan in there, from many cities in Japan as well. And certainly the craft work is evolving and ongoing. And by the way, I've been fortunate to work with a lot of amazing people, not just in Japan. So craftsmen in Europe, and even here in Austin, Texas, where I am now, some guys doing some really, really incredible stuff. So, this ethos is not going to die easily, and it's up to us just to keep the conversation going.
Absolutely, absolutely. So I will include the links, of course, for anybody that wants to know more and check out that stuff. So, but thank you so much, Mike. This was wonderful. I love hearing these real world stories, and I think this is a very important topic. So I'm glad I got to talk to you again. Thank you.
Thank you, Tony. I really appreciate it, and appreciate everyone who tunes in.
If you enjoyed the show, don't forget to subscribe. I tend to put out episodes twice a month, on the 1st of the month and the 21st, and occasionally I even drop some bonus episodes. So if you're not subscribed, you're going to miss out. Also, don't forget to leave a review in your podcast app of choice. That would be greatly appreciated. If you have any ideas for future episodes or questions, you can reach me via email, mail@japankyo.com. That's JAPANKYO.com. And if you can afford to do so, please consider supporting the show financially. There's the Patreon and the Ko-fi. Of course, the Ko-fi is for one-time donations, and you can join the Patreon for as little as $1 a month. japankyo.com/Patreon. Links are down below. Thanks for listening, and 次回まで.